Dr. Hypatia Carter sat at her cluttered desk in the university's astrophysics department, idly twirling a pen between her fingers. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room and bathing it in a golden hue. Just as she was about to call it a day, her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. The name on the screen made her pause. Dr. Jonathan Hargrove, a renowned but reclusive astronomer whose groundbreaking work had earned him both accolades and whispers of eccentricity. "Dr. Carter speaking," she answered, curiosity piqued. "Hypatia, it's Jonathan. I have a proposition for you, one that could redefine our understanding of the universe." Hargrove's voice crackled through the line, filled with an enthusiasm that was almost infectious. Intrigued, Hypatia leaned forward. "I'm listening. There's an old observatory, Blackwood Observatory, which has been abandoned for nearly a century. It was the site of a tragic explosion that killed several astronomers. The place is steeped in mystery and forgotten research. I've managed to secure funding to restore it and resume the work they started. I need someone with your expertise and curiosity. Will you join me?" Hypatia's heart raced. The chance to work with Hargrove on such an enigmatic project was tempting. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow. I'll send a car to pick you up at dawn. Pack for an extended stay." As the call ended, Hypatia's mind whirled with possibilities. She spent the night packing and researching Blackwood Observatory, uncovering only sparse details about its tragic past. The explosion in 1924 had claimed the lives of 8 astronomers and left the building in ruins. Since then, it had been the subject of ghost stories and urban legends, but nothing concrete. She couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. The next morning, a sleek black car arrived at her doorstep, precisely on time. The journey to the observatory was long and winding, taking them deep into the countryside, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The driver, a silent, stone-faced man, offered no conversation, leaving Hypatia to her thoughts and the growing sense of isolation. As they approached their destination, the scenery grew more desolate. The once paved road turned to gravel, and the trees seemed to loom closer, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. Finally, they arrived at the gates of Blackwood Observatory. The building stood atop a hill, its silhouette stark against the overcast sky. It was an imposing structure with tall, narrow windows and ivy creeping up its stone walls. The dome of the main observatory was partially collapsed, a grim reminder of the explosion that had shattered its tranquility. Hypatia stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the chilly air. Jonathan Hargrove was waiting for her at the entrance, his silver hair tousled by the wind and a gleam of excitement in his eyes. "Welcome to Blackwood, Hypatia. Let me introduce you to the team," he said, leading her inside. The interior of the observatory was a stark contrast to its decaying exterior. The main hall had been partially restored, with modern equipment set up alongside the original fixtures. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. Hypatia's eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing a group of individuals busy with various tasks. "Meet Dr. Sophia Bennett, our resident historian and expert on Blackwood's past," Jonathan said, gesturing to a woman with sharp features and intense eyes. "And this is Dr. Alan Fitzgerald, our engineer, who's been working tirelessly to restore the equipment." Sophia nodded curtly, while Alan gave a brief, distracted wave before returning to his work. Hypatia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the place's history settle around her. "What exactly happened here, Jonathan?" He sighed, looking up at the dome. "That's what we're here to find out. But be warned, Hypatia. Blackwood has secrets, and they're not all eager to be uncovered." As the first night approached, Hypatia couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into a place where the past and present were inextricably linked, and where the line between science and the supernatural was disturbingly blurred. Hypatia spent the rest of the day acquainting herself with the layout of the observatory and her new colleagues. The building's labyrinthine halls seemed designed to disorient, with doorways that led to unexpected places and staircases that creaked ominously with each step. By dusk, she found herself standing at a large window in the main observatory room, gazing out at the encroaching darkness. Dinner was a subdued affair, held in a small dining room that had been hastily cleaned and set up with mismatched chairs and a long, scratched table. The atmosphere was tense, each member of the team lost in their thoughts or the tasks at hand. Hypatia found herself sitting next to Dr. Bennett, who seemed more approachable now than during their initial introduction. "So, what's your take on this place?" Hypatia asked, breaking the silence. Sophia glanced at her, eyes flickering with something between excitement and fear. "It's fascinating, but there's a heaviness here, an oppressive presence that's hard to ignore. The stories about this place, about the spirits of the dead astronomers, aren't just legends. There's something real to them." Before Hypatia could probe further, Jonathan stood up, drawing everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for being here. Our work at Blackwood is crucial, not just for astronomy, but for understanding what happened here a century ago. We'll start our observations tonight. The skies are clear, and it's the perfect opportunity." The group dispersed after dinner, each heading to their assigned stations. Hypatia made her way to the observation deck, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. As she ascended the final staircase, she noticed the air growing colder, almost unnaturally so. She shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her. The observation deck was a large, circular room with a retractable roof. Ancient telescopes stood alongside modern counterparts, a juxtaposition of past and present. Alan was already there, tinkering with one of the older telescopes, muttering to himself. "Having trouble?" Hypatia asked, trying to sound cheerful despite the chill creeping into her bones. "Just some calibration issues," Alan replied without looking up. "These old machines have a lot of character, but they're temperamental." Hypatia nodded and moved to her own station, setting up her equipment. As the night deepened, the team settled into a rhythm, each engrossed in their work. The only sounds were the hum of computers, the clicking of keyboards, and the occasional scrape of metal against metal. It was just past midnight when Hypatia first heard it, a faint whispering, like distant voices carried on the wind. She paused, straining to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. She glanced around the room, but no one else seemed to notice anything amiss. Determined to stay focused, she turned her attention back to the telescope. But the whispering returned, louder this time, almost insistent. It seemed to come from all around her, echoing off the walls and filling her mind with a sense of dread. "Did you hear that?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Alan looked up, his face pale. "Hear what?" "The whispering," Hypatia said, her voice trembling. "It's like voices." Sophia and Jonathan exchanged uneasy glances. "We've all heard it," Sophia admitted. "It started as soon as we arrived. At first I thought it was just the wind or my imagination, but now it feels like we're being watched," Jonathan finished, his tone grim. "There's a presence here, something that doesn't want us to uncover the truth." A sudden, piercing scream cut through the night, shattering the uneasy calm. The team froze, eyes wide with terror, as the sound echoed through the observatory. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a cry of anguish that sent chills down their spines. "What was that?" Alan whispered, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as the whispering grew louder, more urgent. Hypatia felt a cold hand brush against her arm, and she recoiled, heart pounding. "We need to get out of here," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "Everyone, stay close and move quickly. We'll regroup in the main hall." In the darkness, they stumbled and fumbled their way out of the observation deck, the whispering voices following them, growing ever more menacing. Hypatia's mind raced with questions and fears, but one thing was certain. The spirits of Blackwood Observatory were not at rest, and their presence was only beginning to reveal itself. The group huddled together in the main hall, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of emergency lanterns. The old building creaked and groaned around them, as if protesting their presence. Hypatia's heart still pounded from their frantic escape, and she could see the same fear mirrored in the eyes of her colleagues. Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "We need to stay calm and figure out what just happened. Clearly there's more going on here than we anticipated." Sophia nodded, her expression grim. "The whispers, the cold. It's as if the very air is charged with something. I've read about hauntings, but experiencing it firsthand is different." Alan, usually composed and methodical, looked visibly shaken. "What do we do now? We can't work under these conditions." Jonathan looked at Hypatia, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "We need to understand what we're dealing with. Hypatia, you mentioned the whispering voices. Did you hear anything specific?" Hypatia shook her head. "It was like a jumble of voices, too many to make out clearly. But there was a sense of urgency, almost like they were trying to warn us." Sophia spoke up, her voice tinged with excitement despite the fear. "There are stories about the explosion, that it wasn't just an accident. Some believed the original astronomers were trying to contact something otherworldly." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I've come across similar theories. If they did summon something, perhaps it's still here, trapped and angry." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. The idea that they might be dealing with a malevolent entity was terrifying, yet it also explained the strange phenomena they had encountered. "We need more information," Hypatia said finally. "There must be records, journals, something that can tell us what they were doing before the explosion." Sophia's eyes lit up. "The library. It's one of the few rooms that survived relatively intact. I've been cataloging the documents there. Maybe we'll find some answers." With renewed purpose, the team made their way to the library, a large, dusty room filled with towering bookshelves and old wooden furniture. The air was thick with the smell of aged paper and leather, a stark contrast to the cold, clinical atmosphere of the observatory. Sophia led them to a table piled high with old journals and notebooks. "These are the personal journals of Dr. William Blackwood, the head astronomer at the time of the explosion. I've been trying to piece together his notes, but it's slow going." Hypatia picked up one of the journals, its leather cover cracked and worn. As she flipped through the pages, she felt a chill run down her spine. The handwriting was neat but hurried, filled with observations, calculations, and increasingly frantic entries. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "We are on the verge of a breakthrough, but I fear we are meddling with forces beyond our understanding. The others are eager, but I sense a growing presence, watching, waiting. We must proceed with caution. The team exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that Dr. Blackwood and his colleagues had been delving into something dangerous, and the consequences had been catastrophic. "Keep looking," Jonathan urged. "We need to find out exactly what they were trying to do." Hours passed as they pored over the journals, piecing together the fragments of Dr. Blackwood's work. The atmosphere in the library grew oppressive, the shadows lengthening and the air growing colder. The whispering voices returned, faint and distant at first, then growing louder, more insistent. Hypatia's hands trembled as she turned the pages, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. "They were trying to open a portal," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "A gateway to another dimension. They believed it would allow them to observe celestial phenomena in real time. But something went wrong." Jonathan nodded, his face pale. "And whatever they contacted, whatever came through that portal, is still here." The whispering grew to a crescendo, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. The lanterns flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut, and the temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the cold air. "We need to leave," Alan said, his voice shaking. "Now!" But as they turned to go, a figure materialized in the doorway, a translucent apparition of a man in an old-fashioned suit, his face twisted in an expression of anguish. He raised a hand as if pleading for help, and then vanished as quickly as he had appeared. The team stood frozen, the reality of their situation sinking in. They were not alone in Blackwood Observatory. The spirits of those who had perished in the explosion were still here, and they were trying to communicate. But what were they trying to say? And could the team survive long enough to find out? The shock of the apparition's sudden appearance left the team paralyzed for several long moments. Hypatia could still see the haunted expression of the ghostly man imprinted in her mind. The room felt even colder now, as if the very presence of the spirit had drained what little warmth remained. "We need to document this," Jonathan finally said, breaking the silence. "We have to approach this scientifically." Sophia, visibly shaken, nodded in agreement. "I'll set up recording devices and motion sensors throughout the observatory. If the spirits are trying to communicate, we need to capture it." As they set up the equipment, Hypatia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen life, and the whispering voices were a constant, maddening presence. The team worked quickly, driven by a mix of fear and determination. By the time they finished, night had fully settled over the observatory. The only light came from their lanterns and the occasional flash of their cameras. They gathered in the main hall once more, the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavily on them. "Let's conduct a session," Jonathan suggested. "We need to try and communicate directly." Hypatia's heart raced. The thought of speaking to the spirits was both thrilling and terrifying. "How do we begin?" Jonathan produced a small, antique spirit board and set it on the table. The others gathered around, their expressions a mix of skepticism and fear. "Everyone place your fingers lightly on the planchette," Jonathan instructed. "We'll ask questions and hopefully we'll get some answers." The team did as instructed, and Jonathan began. "Is there anyone here with us?" For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move, spelling out a word. "Yes." Hypatia felt a chill run down her spine. The planchette moved with a force that felt almost electric, as if the spirits themselves were guiding it, Jonathan continued, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, spelling out a name. "William." Dr. William Blackwood, Hypatia thought, her mind racing. The head astronomer who had perished in the explosion. "What do you want?" Jonathan asked. The planchette moved more quickly this time, as if the spirit was eager to communicate. "Warning." Hypatia's breath caught in her throat. A warning? But about what? "What are you warning us about?" Jonathan pressed. "Danger." The planchette jerked violently, breaking contact with their fingers. The room grew colder still, and the whispering voices rose to a deafening level. The team looked around, eyes wide with fear. The air seemed to shimmer, and suddenly, the ghostly figure of Dr. William Blackwood materialized in front of them, more solid and defined than before. "Leave this place," the spirit intoned, his voice a hollow echo. "You are in grave danger." "Danger from what?" Hypatia managed to ask, her voice trembling. "The entity we summoned," Dr. Blackwood replied, his spectral form flickering. "It is bound to this observatory, but it grows stronger. We tried to contain it, but we failed. It seeks to escape." The implications were horrifying. The entity, whatever it was, had been trapped here for nearly a century, growing more powerful with each passing year. "How can we stop it?" Jonathan asked, desperation in his voice. Dr. Blackwood's form wavered, his expression one of profound sorrow. "You must find the seal. It is the key to containing the entity. But be warned, it will not let you go easily." With that, the spirit faded, leaving the team in stunned silence. The whispering voices subsided, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. "We need to find that seal," Jonathan said, his voice resolute. "It's our only hope." Hypatia nodded, determination stealing her nerves. They had a mission now, and the stakes couldn't be higher. They had to find the seal and stop the entity before it was too late. But as they prepared to search the observatory, Hypatia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and that the entity was already aware of their plans. As they split up to begin their search, the true horror of their situation settled over them like a shroud. The spirits of Blackwood Observatory had given them a warning, but it was up to them to heed it and survive the night. The library became their base of operations as they embarked on their search for the seal. The team pored over every document, every scrap of paper that might give them a clue about the entity and how to contain it. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of their task pressing heavily on them. Hypatia focused on Dr. Blackwood's journals, hoping to find something they had missed before. She could feel the eyes of the spirits upon her, their presence a constant reminder of the stakes. The journals were filled with technical details and personal reflections, but it was an entry near the end that caught her attention. March 13th, 1924. "We have made contact. The entity is unlike anything we have ever encountered. It is both beautiful and terrible, a being of pure energy and malevolence. We have managed to bind it to this place using the seal, but the containment is fragile. I fear we have awakened something beyond our control." Hypatia's heart raced. This was it, the key to understanding what they were dealing with. She continued reading, her fingers trembling. March 21st, 1924. "The entity grows restless. It tests the boundaries of its prison, seeking a way out. We have fortified the seal, but I am not confident it will hold. We must find a more permanent solution, or risk unleashing this horror upon the world." Hypatia shared her findings with the team. Jonathan's face was grim as he digested the information. The seal is the only thing keeping the entity contained. If it breaks free... We need to find where they placed it, Sophia said, her voice urgent. There must be some clue in these documents. As they searched, Alan discovered a set of blueprints for the observatory. He spread them out on the table, the faded lines revealing the building's original design. Look here, he said, pointing to a section marked sub-basement. I didn't realize there was a sub-basement, Jonathan said, studying the plans. It must have been sealed off after the explosion. That's where they would have put it, Sophia said. The deepest, most secure part of the observatory. Hypatia felt a chill. The sub-basement was likely untouched since the explosion, a place where the entity's presence would be strongest. We need to go down there, she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. They armed themselves with flashlights, tools, and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. The journey to the sub-basement took them through the darkest, most decayed parts of the observatory. As they descended the narrow staircase, the air grew colder, and the whispering voices returned, louder and more insistent. The sub-basement was a cavernous space, filled with the remnants of old experiments and long-forgotten equipment. The walls were lined with shelves of dusty books and strange instruments. In the center of the room stood a large, intricately carved stone pedestal. This must be it, Jonathan said, approaching the pedestal cautiously. Hypatia's eyes were drawn to the symbols etched into the stone. They were unlike any she had seen before, a mix of ancient runes and celestial markings. The air around the pedestal felt charged, as if the very stones vibrated with power. Suddenly the room grew even colder, and the whispering voices turned to anguished cries. The entity was aware of their presence, and it was angry. The lanterns flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move and writhe on their own. We need to find the seal, Hypatia said, her voice barely audible over the din. Sophia spotted a compartment at the base of the pedestal and pried it open. Inside was a small, ornate box. She opened it with trembling hands, revealing a disc of polished obsidian, inscribed with the same strange symbols. This is it, Sophia said, holding the seal up to the light. As she did, the room was filled with a blinding flash. When their vision cleared, they saw the figure of Dr. William Blackwood standing before them, more solid and imposing than before. You have found the seal, he said, his voice echoing in the confined space. But it will not be enough. The entity is too powerful now. You must reinforce the seal and bind it anew. How do we do that? Jonathan asked, desperation in his voice. Blackwood's form flickered, his expression one of deep sorrow. The ritual requires a sacrifice. A life must be given to bind the entity once more. It is the only way. The team recoiled in horror. The implications were clear. One of them would have to die to save the others and prevent the entity from escaping. The reality of their situation hit them like a physical blow, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Hypatia looked at her colleagues, her mind racing. They had come so far, uncovered so much, but now they faced an impossible choice. The spirits of the past had given them a warning, but it was up to them to decide how to act on it. The whispering voices grew louder, more urgent. Time was running out. The entity was growing stronger, and the fragile balance between worlds was about to tip. They had to act, and quickly, or risk unleashing an unimaginable horror upon the world. The return to the main hall was a somber affair, the weight of their discovery heavy on their minds. The air was thick with tension, and the spirits seemed to sense their growing despair, their whispering voices more insistent than ever. The team's faces were pale, their eyes haunted by the realization of what was required to stop the entity. As they regrouped, the atmosphere grew colder, the very walls of the observatory seeming to close in around them. Hypatia could feel the presence of the entity, its malevolent energy pressing against her mind like an icy hand. They needed to find a way to reinforce the seal, but the cost was almost too much to bear. "We need to find another way," Jonathan said, his voice filled with desperation. "There has to be a way to contain the entity without a sacrifice." "The journals were clear," Sophia replied, her voice trembling. "The ritual requires a life. Without it, the seal will fail." Alan, who had been silent for most of the discussion, spoke up. "Even if we decide to go through with it, how do we choose who will be the sacrifice?" The question hung in the air, a dark cloud that seemed to sap the remaining warmth from the room. No one had an answer, and the silence stretched on, filled with the increasingly agitated whispers of the spirits. As they debated their options, the haunting intensified. Shadows moved with a life of their own, writhing and twisting in the corners of their vision. The whispering voices grew louder, more urgent, filling their minds with fragmented thoughts and memories. The temperature plummeted, and a sense of overwhelming dread settled over them. Hypatia tried to focus, but the voices were relentless, their whispers seeping into her thoughts. She could hear her own fears echoed back at her, twisted and amplified by the entity's malevolent influence. She looked around and saw the same fear reflected in the eyes of her colleagues. Jonathan suddenly clutched his head, his face contorted in pain. "Get out of my mind!" he screamed, collapsing to the floor. Sophia rushed to his side, her expression one of panic. "Jonathan, what's happening?" Hypatia knelt beside him, trying to soothe him. "It's the entity. It's trying to break us down, to weaken our resolve." Jonathan's eyes were wild with fear as he looked at them. "It's showing me things, horrible things. My family, my failures. It's using my deepest fears against me." Hypatia could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, its influence seeping into their very thoughts. She knew they had to act quickly, or risk being consumed by the darkness. "We need to reinforce the seal now," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "We can't let it break us." Alan looked around, his face pale. "But who? Who will do it?" Before anyone could respond, the whispering voices reached a crescendo, filling the room with a deafening roar. The walls seemed to vibrate with the force of the entity's rage, and the shadows coalesced into a dark, writhing mass in the center of the room. The apparition of Dr. Blackwood appeared once more, his form flickering and unstable. "You must act now," he urged, his voice barely audible over the din. "The entity grows stronger. If you do not reinforce the seal, it will break free." Hypatia looked around at her colleagues, her heart breaking at the thought of losing any of them. They had come so far, faced so much together. But the choice was clear. They had to act, and one of them had to make the ultimate sacrifice. Sophia stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "I've always believed in the importance of this work, and if my life can save countless others, then it's worth it." The team protested, but Sophia silenced them with a raised hand. "There's no time to argue. We need to reinforce the seal, and we need to do it now." Hypatia felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged Sophia. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We'll never forget this." Sophia nodded, a sad smile on her face. "Just make sure it's worth it. Finish what we started and keep the entity contained." With the help of Dr. Blackwood's spirit, they prepared the ritual. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sophia stood before the pedestal, the seal in her hands. The shadows writhed around them, the entity's rage palpable in the air. As Sophia began the ritual, the temperature plummeted further, and the whispering voices reached a fever pitch. The entity fought against the binding, its malevolent presence pressing down on them with an almost physical force. But Sophia's resolve was unbreakable, her voice steady as she chanted the ancient words. With a final desperate cry, the entity lashed out, but it was too late. The seal flared with a blinding light, and the shadows were sucked back into the pedestal. The temperature began to rise, and the whispering voices faded into silence. Sophia collapsed to the floor, her life force drained by the ritual. Hypatia rushed to her side, tears streaming down her face. "Sophia! No!" But Sophia's eyes were peaceful, her final breath a soft sigh. She had given her life to save them, to save the world from the entity's wrath. Dr. Blackwood's spirit appeared once more, his form more solid and serene. "She has done what needed to be done. The entity is bound once more. But remember, the seal is only as strong as your resolve. Protect it, and protect each other." With that, he faded away, leaving the team to mourn their loss. They had succeeded in reinforcing the seal, but at a terrible cost. The haunting had intensified, and they had faced their deepest fears. But they had also found the strength to fight back, to protect the world from the darkness. As they stood in the now silent observatory, Hypatia vowed to honor Sophia's sacrifice. They would continue their work, uncover the secrets of the past, and ensure that the entity remained bound. The haunting had shown them the true power of the human spirit and the lengths to which they would go to protect the ones they loved. The following days passed in a haze of grief and determination. The team worked tirelessly, driven by Sophia's sacrifice to ensure the entity remained bound. Yet, despite their efforts, the atmosphere in Blackwood Observatory remained charged with an oppressive energy, and the whispers persisted, though fainter and more distant. Hypatia couldn't shake the feeling that their work was not yet done. The seal had been reinforced, but the entity's presence still lingered, a malevolent force waiting for any opportunity to break free. The journals had hinted at a deeper secret, something more than just the seal, but she had yet to uncover it. Late one night, as the others slept fitfully, Hypatia returned to the library. The room felt colder than usual, the shadows deeper. She lit a lantern and began to search through the remaining journals and blueprints, hoping to find the missing piece of the puzzle. Hours passed, and Hypatia's eyes grew tired, her mind foggy. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed a loose floorboard near the far wall. Curiosity piqued, she pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, leather-bound book, its cover adorned with strange symbols. Hypatia's heart raced as she opened the book. The pages were filled with detailed drawings and complex equations, but it was the final entry that caught her attention. April 10th, 1924. The seal holds, but it is not enough. The entity's power grows, feeding on the fear and despair within these walls. There is another way, a ritual that requires not just a sacrifice, but a binding of souls. It is dangerous, and the consequences are unknown, but it may be our only hope. Hypatia knew she had to share this with the others. She woke Jonathan and Alan, and they gathered in the main hall, the book between them. Jonathan read the entry aloud, his expression growing more serious with each word. "A binding of souls," he said, looking up. "What do you think it means?" Hypatia shook her head. "I'm not entirely sure, but it sounds like a more permanent solution, a way to bind the entity in such a way that it can never break free." Alan frowned. "But at what cost? We've already lost Sophia. How many more sacrifices are we expected to make?" "There has to be another way," Hypatia insisted. "Maybe we can adapt the ritual, use our combined strength to bind the entity without another life being lost." Jonathan nodded slowly. "It's worth a try. We owe it to Sophia to find a way to end this once and for all." The next day, they began preparing for the ritual. They gathered every resource they could find, consulting old texts and journals for any hint of how to proceed. The process was slow and arduous, the oppressive energy in the observatory making it difficult to concentrate. As night fell, they assembled in the sub-basement, where the pedestal and seal were located. The air was thick with tension, the shadows seeming to pulse with a life of their own. Hypatia felt a chill run down her spine as they began to set up for the ritual. They drew a large circle around the pedestal, inscribing it with the same strange symbols found in the book. The atmosphere grew colder still, the whispers growing louder as if the entity sensed their intentions. "We need to be strong," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "This will only work if we are united in our purpose. We must bind the entity with our combined strength." Hypatia nodded, feeling a sense of determination wash over her. They took their positions around the circle, joining hands and focusing their minds on the task at hand. The air hummed with energy, the symbols on the floor glowing faintly. As they began to chant the ancient words, the temperature dropped further, and the shadows around them writhed violently. The entity's presence grew stronger, a palpable force pushing against their minds, trying to break their concentration. Hypatia felt a surge of fear, but forced herself to stay focused. The chanting grew louder, the symbols glowing brighter as they poured their energy into the ritual. The pedestal began to vibrate, the seal pulsing with light. Suddenly, a dark, swirling mass emerged from the shadows, coalescing into a terrifying form. The entity, a being of pure malevolence, lashed out at them, its rage a tangible force. "We have to hold on," Jonathan shouted, his grip on Hypatia's hand tightening. "Don't let it break us." Hypatia could feel the entity's power, a cold, suffocating presence that threatened to overwhelm them. But she also felt the strength of her companions, their determination and resolve bolstering her own. They continued to chant, their voices rising in defiance. The entity shrieked, its form flickering and writhing as the power of the ritual took hold. The symbols on the floor flared with blinding light, and the air crackled with energy. Hypatia could feel the very fabric of reality shifting as the binding took effect. With one final desperate cry, the entity was pulled back into the pedestal, the seal glowing brightly as it absorbed the entity's power. The shadows receded, and the air grew warmer, the oppressive presence lifting. The team collapsed to the floor, exhausted but triumphant. The entity was bound, its power contained within the seal. They had succeeded, but at great cost. Hypatia looked around at her colleagues, their faces pale and drawn, but filled with a sense of relief. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The haunting had intensified, but they had found the strength to fight back, to protect the world from the malevolent force that had threatened to consume them. As they left the sub-basement, the first light of dawn breaking through the windows, Hypatia knew that their work was not yet done. They had to ensure the seal remained intact, to protect the world from the darkness that lurked within Blackwood Observatory. But for now, they could rest, knowing they had faced their deepest fears and prevailed. The dawn brought a tentative peace to Blackwood Observatory. The team, though exhausted, felt a glimmer of hope as they gathered in the main hall. The entity had been bound, but the ritual had left them with more questions than answers. Hypatia knew they had to delve deeper into the observatory's past to fully understand the forces at play. Hypatia decided to start with Dr. William Blackwood's journals. She needed to understand the man who had led the original team, the one who had first encountered the entity. There had to be something in his writings that would explain the entity's origin and how they might permanently contain it. As she read through the journals, a pattern began to emerge. Dr. Blackwood had been a man of great ambition, his work driven by a desire to push the boundaries of human knowledge. He had been fascinated by the idea of contacting other dimensions, believing it would revolutionize their understanding of the universe. But his ambition had blinded him to the dangers. One entry in particular caught Hypatia's attention. It was dated a few weeks before the explosion, March 2nd, 1924. We have made contact with an entity from beyond our realm. Its power is immense, its knowledge unfathomable. But there is a darkness to it, a hunger that we cannot fully comprehend. I fear we have unleashed something beyond our control. Hypatia felt a chill as she read the words. Dr. Blackwood had known the risks, but had continued anyway, driven by his thirst for discovery. She could see parallels to their own situation, the way they had been drawn to Blackwood Observatory by the promise of knowledge, only to find themselves ensnared by forces beyond their understanding. She shared her findings with Jonathan and Alan. Dr. Blackwood's ambition led him to make contact with the entity, but he didn't fully understand what he was dealing with. We need to learn from his mistakes if we're going to contain this thing permanently. Jonathan nodded. Agreed. We need to find out exactly how they made contact and what they did to try to contain the entity. There might be clues in the experiments they conducted before the explosion. Alan suggested they search the observatory's old laboratory. It was one of the few places they hadn't thoroughly explored. They armed themselves with lanterns and descended into the lower levels of the observatory, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The laboratory was a sprawling, cluttered space filled with ancient equipment and yellowing papers. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay. They split up, each taking a section to search for anything that might shed light on the original experiments. Hypatia found a stack of old notebooks in a corner, the pages brittle and covered in dust. She carefully opened one and began to read. It was filled with detailed notes on the experiments, the results meticulously recorded. Here, she called out, holding up the notebook. These are the records of their experiments. It looks like they were trying to harness the entity's power, to use it for their own purposes. Jonathan and Alan joined her, their faces grim as they read through the notes. They were trying to bind the entity to a physical object, to use it as a source of energy, Jonathan said, shaking his head. No wonder things went wrong. As they continued to search, Alan found a hidden compartment in one of the lab tables. Inside was a small, ornate box, similar to the one that had held the seal. He opened it carefully, revealing a crystal vial filled with a shimmering liquid. "What is this?" Alan asked, holding the vial up to the light. Hypatia examined it closely. It's labeled as essence of the entity. It looks like they were able to extract some of its power and contain it in this vial. Jonathan's eyes widened. This could be the key. If we can understand how they extracted and contained the entity's power, we might be able to find a way to neutralize it permanently. The team spent the next few days analyzing the vial and the notes from the experiments. It was painstaking work, but gradually they began to piece together the process. They would need to replicate the original experiment, but with the knowledge they had gained, they could modify it to safely neutralize the entity. As they prepared for the final ritual, the haunting presence in the observatory grew more intense. The whispers were louder, more desperate, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. The entity knew what they were planning and was fighting back with all its remaining strength. On the night of the ritual, the team gathered in the sub-basement once more. The air was charged with tension, the temperature dropping sharply as they began the preparations. They had fortified the seals and inscribed the protective symbols, but the sense of danger was palpable. Hypatia held the crystal vial carefully, feeling the entity's power pulsing within it. "This is our last chance," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "We have to finish what Dr. Blackwood started, but we must be careful not to make the same mistakes." Jonathan and Alan nodded, their expressions determined. They took their positions around the pedestal, joining hands and focusing their minds on the task ahead. The air hummed with energy as they began the modified ritual, their voices rising in a chant. As they chanted, the shadows around them thickened, and the oppressive presence grew stronger. The entity's rage was a tangible force, pushing against them, trying to break their concentration. But they held firm, their voices unwavering. The vial glowed with a brilliant light as the ritual progressed, the liquid inside bubbling and swirling. The symbols on the floor flared with energy, and the pedestal began to vibrate. The entity's screams echoed through the room, a sound of pure malevolence. With the final desperate surge, the entity lashed out, but the power of the ritual held it at bay. The vial shattered, the essence of the entity dissipating into the air, and the shadows recoiled, sucked back into the pedestal. The oppressive presence lifted, and the air grew warmer, the whispers fading into silence. The team collapsed to the floor, exhausted but triumphant. They had confronted the past, faced their fears, and succeeded in neutralizing the entity's power. The observatory was still haunted, but the malevolent force that had threatened to consume them was gone. Hypatia looked at her colleagues, their faces pale but filled with relief. They had done it. They had broken the cycle of darkness and brought light back to Blackwood Observatory. But as they emerged from the sub-basement, she knew their work was not yet done. The past had been confronted, but the future still held its own challenges. They had faced the darkness and prevailed, but they would need to remain vigilant. The secrets of Blackwood Observatory had been uncovered, but there were still mysteries to be solved, still shadows to be faced. But for now, they could rest, knowing they had made a difference, knowing they had protected the world from the darkness that lurked within. The air in Blackwood Observatory felt lighter after the ritual, but the team knew their work was not yet done. The haunting presence had diminished, but the observatory still held a lingering darkness. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, a sense of urgency drove them. They needed to ensure the entity's power was truly neutralized and that the observatory would not become a beacon for other malevolent forces. Hypatia and Jonathan worked side by side, cataloging their findings and securing the remaining journals and artifacts. Alan focused on packing up the delicate scientific instruments and ensuring their data was safely stored. They moved quickly, their shared experience binding them together in a silent pact of determination and resilience. As they prepared to leave, Hypatia couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. The whispering voices had faded, but the shadows seemed to cling to the edges of her vision, a constant reminder of the entity they had fought to contain. She glanced at Jonathan, who gave her a reassuring nod. "We've done everything we can here," he said, "but we need to get out before nightfall. This place has a way of drawing you back in." Hypatia nodded, her resolve firm. "Let's finish up and get out of here." The final moments in the observatory were a blur of activity. They double-checked the seals, ensuring the protective symbols were intact. The sense of urgency grew with each passing minute, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on them. As they exited the building, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grounds. The observatory loomed behind them, a silent sentinel watching their departure. Hypatia took one last look at the structure, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. They had survived, but the cost had been high. They loaded their equipment into the car and drove away, the observatory growing smaller in the rearview mirror. The drive back to civilization was silent, each member of the team lost in their thoughts. The weight of their experience hung over them, a shared burden that would take time to fully process. When they finally reached the town, they checked into a small motel. Exhausted, they collapsed onto the beds, the events of the past days catching up with them. Sleep came fitfully, dreams filled with whispers and shadows, but the presence of the entity was noticeably absent. The next morning, they gathered in the motel's small dining area, a sense of camaraderie binding them. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger for it. "What do we do now?" Alan asked, sipping his coffee. "We need to ensure the information we've gathered is shared with the right people," Jonathan said. "There are organizations that deal with these kinds of phenomena. They need to know what we've found and how we contain the entity." Hypatia nodded. "And we need to write our own accounts. The scientific community needs to understand the risks and the reality of what we've faced. It's not just about the entity, it's about the consequences of pushing boundaries without understanding the dangers." They spent the next few days compiling their notes, writing reports, and reaching out to experts in paranormal research. The process was cathartic, helping them to process their experiences and find some sense of closure. Hypatia found herself reflecting on Sophia's sacrifice and the legacy of Dr. Blackwood's work. They had been drawn to Blackwood Observatory by a desire for knowledge, but they had found something far more profound. The entity had tested them, revealed their deepest fears, and forced them to confront their own limits. As they prepared to return to their respective lives, Hypatia felt a sense of resolve. The haunting of Blackwood Observatory had been a harrowing experience, but it had also brought them closer together and shown them the strength of the human spirit. On their final night together, they gathered in the motel's small lounge, toasting to their survival and to the memory of Sophia. The atmosphere was lighter, the oppressive weight of the observatory left behind. "To Sophia," Jonathan said, raising his glass. "Her courage and sacrifice made this possible." "To Sophia," the others echoed, their voices filled with respect and sorrow. As they parted ways the next morning, Hypatia felt a sense of closure. The haunting of Blackwood Observatory was behind them, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, ready to face whatever challenges the future held. Hypatia drove away from the motel, the road stretching out before her. The sun was shining, the sky clear and blue. The shadows of Blackwood Observatory were behind her, but the experience had changed her, deepened her understanding of the world and of herself. As she headed back to her life, she knew that the haunting of Blackwood Observatory would always be a part of her. But it was a part that had made her stronger, more resilient, and more determined to seek out the truth, no matter where it might lead.